This program is brought to you by Agnes Scott College. For more information about Agnes Scott College, please visit our website at agnesscott.edu.
It's my pleasure today to announce that Gundolf Graml is going to speak today. Gundolf he's done a lot of things. So he did his master's in German literature in Salzburg before coming to the University of Minnesota to do another master's and a PhD. He was visiting assistant professor at Graml for a few years before coming here in 2008. His research is into 20th, 21st century German studies, especially film, cultural studies, ethnicity and race in German and Austrian culture. So he's had two recent book chapters published in 2010 already. One is Black Bodies on White Snow, the Reconstruction of Germanness as White in Louis Streicher's The Prodigal Son, from Black to Schwarz, crossovers between African America and Germany. And the second one was Roaming Fantasies and Trapped Bodies, Tracing Identity Construction in Florian Flicker's Susie Washington, new Austrian film, and then there's the editors and everything.
Yeah,
okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm a scientist, we don't mention editors and things. Sorry. So, I was confused. So, the talk is going to be an excerpt from his current book project, Remapping Austria, Tourism, Space, and National Identity After 1945. And the title is Your Research is on What? Tourism and National Identity, an Austrian Case Study. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming out. I need to set up some slides here. I know it's the last week before spring break, so I'm sure everybody would have something else to do. I appreciate your coming. The title of my talk pretty much summarizes the reactions I got when I first started working on this topic back when I was in graduate school. He was a native Austrian writing on his dissertation in the American Midwest, receiving grant money to travel to Austria and do research on tourism. That sounded fishy. And during one of my first trips back to Austria, even my family suspected that I had dropped out of graduate school and was hiding it from them by coming up with these strange research projects. What I would like to do today is provide a brief introduction to the interdisciplinary study of tourism and then discuss some specific examples from my research. And I hope I will talk for not longer than about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Tourism has become one of the most important economic sectors on the globe, and for Austria especially, tourism has been an important revenue source throughout the 20th century, and it continues to be that. The prominent status of tourism in Austria's societal and political discourses has also turned it into a frequent target of criticism. Especially since the 1970s, tourism's damaging effects on the environment, on social life in remote mountain communities, and on small-scale economic structures in alpine regions have been criticized by academics, by writers, and by filmmakers, and justifiably so. In the 1980s and 1990s, the critique of tourism merged with criticism of Austria's stubborn repression of its involvement in the crimes of National Socialism between 1938 and 1945. And the general trend of the criticism that occurred in literature and in film, I like to call the Punschkrapfen model. And this is, as Monika and some others might know, this is a Punschkrapfen, an Austrian dessert that is usually made from the leftovers of the previous day in the bakeries. So the brown stuff is all thrown together, it's mixed, and you add a nice quantity of rum to it. You have thin slices of biscuit on top and at the bottom, and then you cover it in this pink icing, frosting. Already about 30 years ago, the Austrian writer Gerhard Fritsch decided that this is the appropriate model to describe the Austrian attitude towards the past and towards the acknowledgement of the Holocaust, with the pink icing of tourism covering up the alcohol-drenched brown mass inside. I like the Punschkopf model, I really do, but it has limited explanatory power. And ever since I know what's in it, I also hesitate to really eat it. The criticism of Austria's tourism industry as a kind of Potemkin village covering up the crimes of National Socialism is justified, yet it also resulted in the image of an allegedly artificial tourism surface covering up a supposedly authentic Austria. This image is problematic in several ways. First, it implies a notion of authenticity that seems to me to be separate from human agency. And second, it appears to tap into stereotypical ideas of the tourist as being intellectually inferior to, let's say, the academic or the writer, the researcher. All of these people who can see through the supposedly false images. In my research, I aim to bridge this divide. Instead of trying to demonstrate that tourism covers up a real Austria, I use a discursive model of tourism. I want to take tourism seriously as a terrain that enables me to trace the formation of Austrian identities after 1945. What do I mean by discursive understanding of tourism? Terms such as tourism discourse or the discourse of tourism are now frequently used in research and studies on tourism, areas that have for a long time occupied themselves mostly with counting visitors and overnight stays. In its most basic form, a discursive understanding of tourism is based on Michel Foucault's analysis of power as fluid and multi-local. This is a welcome complication of typical narratives that, in the case of Austria, depicted, for instance, all powerful German tourists as oppressing and exploiting Austrian peasant families. In other words, it is not that easy anymore to speak of the tourist or the local or the tourist attraction. Instead, we must take into account the constantly changing roles and positionalities of those agents involved, as well as their interaction with and construction of places and spaces. My own research is influenced by cultural geography's further development of this approach. Cultural geographer Mike Krang, for instance, recently formulated the advantages of a discursive conceptualization of tourism as follows, and I quote, "It is not about the image of places as beheld by tourists, but rather the processes and practices of signification, where tourism takes up discourses and representations and uses them in ordering places, making meanings, making distinctions, and thus making places through actions," end quote. Of interest is not so much to what degree the representation of a specific place is authentic per se, but rather how it is constructed and for whom it represents some relative form of authenticity. What counts, to quote Krang again, is the ontology of tourist places rather than the epistemology of their representations. So try to come up with an example for that, the kind of random one. Some of you might know the film The Third Man, about the Vienna in the Cold War. Vienna is a place for smugglers and double agents crossing the borders between the Soviet zone and the American zone. And it would be easy to dismiss this poster, which is heavily used in the advertising for Vienna, as simply a tourism ploy. But at the same time, locations where the film was shot and locations that are prominent in the film, such as the Viennese sewer system, have become places that are now very prominent. And I apologize that this picture is sort of grainy. There are now quite a few tours that you can take through the Viennese sewer system following the traces of the film. But there's also there are citizens groups that try to preserve the sewer system as it is and to prevent changes in its architecture. There is a noticeable interest in the functioning of the sewer system. Now, how many of you have looked into Atlanta's sewer system? Me neither. So that's where I think this is sort of an illustration of this change from simply a tourist representation to an understanding of the ontology of a place, what it means, the different meanings it has for different peoples and their different interests. Places do, in this sense, not exist as geographically fixed and culturally determined entities. Instead, there are multiple simultaneous manifestations of place images. There are, to introduce yet another term that has become prominent in tourism and place studies, multiple and often contradictory performances of places. I do not have the time here and would probably also lack the expertise to trace the complex genealogies of performance theory in philosophy, linguistics, performance in theater studies, sociology, and linguistic anthropology. For my purposes, Judith Butler's theorizations on the performativity of gender were most helpful. Butler argues, and this is, as you well realize, a very simplified rendition of her complex ideas, she argues that gender differences are not based on biological sexual differences, but on a reification of social norms. These norms achieve authority through the reiterative enactments on what a given society considers normal, male and female behaviors. While the resulting identity categories of men and women are usually considered to be the after effect of essential biological differences and traits, there really is, in Butler's view, no essence, origin, or reality prior to or outside the enactment of a multiplicity of performances. It is this notion of spatial performance that inspired me to approach the role of tourism in post-war Austria not as a surface phenomenon that covers up reality, but as a discursive system, a set of performances that creates various manifestations of a reality and a place called Austria. Now, enough with the theory and on to some specific examples here. Until fairly recently, studying tourism in the immediate post-war years in Austria was pretty much considered a waste of time. Very low numbers of visitors and overnight stays reflected the dismal conditions of Austria's infrastructure. Hotels, railroads, and train stations were destroyed. Traveling throughout Europe was restricted heavily, and a severe food shortage did not allow those few hotels that had remained open to adequately feed their guests. This is what the numbers reveal. Yet I concur with British geographer David Crouch's statement that crude consumption figures do not reveal very much of a spatial practice. The low numbers of actual visitors did not prevent the emergence of a discourse of tourism that shaped the way Austrians imagined and performed themselves and their country through certain behaviors, narratives, and images. Already in 1945, then Austrian Chancellor Karl Renner addressed the connection between tourism and the country's reconstruction in a newspaper interview. And he said, "We love our homeland, Heimat, but we need foreigners. We need tourism, and we invite the whole world to be our guest." A similar urgency is noticeable in many newspaper articles of that period, prompting me to apply to Austria the very same provocative question that cultural historian Alan Confino asked of German post-war history, namely, why did some Germans think of tourism after May 8th, 1945. So why did some Austrians think of tourism after 1945? One of the hypotheses I work with is this. The discourse of tourism enabled the performative construction of a geographically coherent place at a time when Austria was divided into 4 occupation areas whose borders resembled, to quote one historian, the borders between enemy nations. The growing tensions between the US and the Soviet Union created a very real fear among Austrians that the demarcation line between the Soviet and the American zones in Austria might become as impermeable and permanent as the one that bisected Germany. And just to show you what you probably have seen for Germany many times, this is the Austrian version of the occupation zones, with the Soviet one appropriately in red. In the green olive colored one is the British occupation zone, yellow American, and blue the French occupation zone. The city of Vienna was divided up among the 4 occupation powers, with the first district of Vienna patrolled by all 4 occupation powers simultaneously, which created these iconic images of the 4 soldiers, Russian, American, British, and French, in one jeep driving around. This fear of disappearing from the globe, and that's what it was to some extent, becomes apparent in the so-called Österreich-Buch, literally translated as the Book of Austria, a very lavishly illustrated book that was intended to present Austria to both its citizens and to the international community. It was for a couple of years the present that was given to diplomats who visited Austria, or when Austrian dignitaries visited other countries, they always had this book with them, which is a 400-page, very expensive tour guide that also covers a couple of thousand years of Austrian history in passing. Already on the book's very first content page, Austria is described, albeit as a void. And I show you here, this is not a very good picture of the first page, and this is the text of the English edition. So that's not my translation, this is the text of the English edition, and it reads, "He who would find Austria on the globe must turn the round ball of the earth slowly on its slanting axis, otherwise he might easily overlook the Austria of the 20th century. Where is this much talked of Austria? What is her place in space and time, in history and culture?" Now, you see on the picture over there, these rhetorical questions are answered with an illustration. And this little statue is a statue called the Venus of Willendorf, and is a piece that size. It's considered to be a fertility goddess. It was found in Austria, has various dates. I think at one point it was dated back to the 15th century before Christ. It illustrates nicely a very prominent view of Austria by historians at that time, who wanted to reshape Austria as this feminine space, this feminine entity, feminine meaning in the patriarchal sense, passive entity, that has always been invaded and trespassed and has never been responsible for anything, and certainly not for the most recent calamities and catastrophes, because it's such a passive, nice space, whereas those virile neighbors to the north, formerly called barbarians and now Germans, commit all the crimes. The rhetorical question about Austria's time-space coordinates, as well as the fear of being overlooked, indicate a certain horror vacui, a place panic, as philosopher Edward Casey calls it, that is part of almost all Western founding myths. It is particularly interesting in this case that the fear of disappearance is somewhat mitigated by what can be read as a male tourist gaze. The text evokes a male tourist, as paradigmatic reader. This absolutely objective reader, his vantage point is not just outside of Austria, but it's really outside the globe. He's looking at the globe and touring the globe looking for Austria. This male tourist or male reader will eventually legitimate the book's version of Austrian history and identity and attest to its innocence. So he pops up now and then throughout the book and then at the end says, yes, this is actually a very nice country that we need to visit and that cannot be blamed for what has happened. The discerning gaze of such an imaginary foreign tourist accompanied many of the first tourism activities in post-war Austria. It either functioned as a legitimizing authority, as in this example, or as a critic that had to be feared, as reactions against the first organized visits of foreign tourist groups demonstrate. In 1946, the Bureau for the Reconstruction of the Tourism Industry, that was its real name, a sub-department of the Ministry of Trade, tried to jumpstart tourism despite the destroyed infrastructure and the lack of food. In these so-called Ausländeraktionen, foreigner actions, a very unfortunate choice of name that evoked wartime actions rather than leisure practices, groups of foreign tourists had to pay upfront for food and lodging in their foreign currency. In return, they received vouchers for selected hotels and restaurants in Austria. And some of these organized visits were also trade-offs. So for instance, the Netherlands agreed to send 2,000 tourists to Austria on trains. These were long chartered trains, if Austria agreed to buy 2,000 tons of tulip bulbs. And so there was a back and forth here. Some of Austria's regional tourist offices panicked when these organized tours were started. Afraid to be compared unfavorably to popular tourist destinations such as Switzerland, the Corinthian Tourism Bureau wrote, quote, "It is our opinion that British travelers would have such negative experiences that they might stay away from Austria for good in the future and inflict long-term damage on Austria's tourism industry." So in all of these reconstruction activities throughout Austria, the imagined look, the gaze of the tourist was very much a part of what politicians and bureaucrats and civil servants tried to do. Although this quote that I just read you seems to emphasize economic concerns, I read it as a confirmation of my thesis that Austria's identity discourse in general longed for legitimization through an allegedly unbiased tourist gaze. The fear of Austria's disappearance had a lot to do with the quite forceful proclamation of Austria's German cultural heritage during the reign of National Socialism. A rather inconvenient truth after 1945, when any relationship to things German interfered with the official narrative of Austria having been Hitler's first victim. German was totally out, Austria was in, and so a retroactive Austrifizierung of history was in order. This process was propelled by the same images and narratives about Habsburg nostalgia and beautiful landscape that had already characterized the tourism and identity discourses of the interwar years. The introductory passage in the Book of Austria here beautifully illustrates this bait and switch process. On the one hand, it pretends that Austria is hard to locate. What is her place in space and time, in history and culture? Yet, on the other hand, it refers to the much talked of Austria. What seems like a contradiction is, in fact, illustrative of the performative function of the tourism discourse in Austria's identity processes. The Austria of 1945 is not the real Austria, so the argument goes. The real Austria is hidden somewhere, and in order to reconstruct it, we must resort to already existing tourist images and narratives, images of the much talked of Austria. How did this performative construction of the new and simultaneously eternal place Austria function on an everyday basis? Who was involved in performing it? The performances included but were certainly not limited to, bodily practices, everyday behavior, aesthetic judgments, and concepts of space. The realm of education was one area where all of these elements came together. In 1950, the Austrian Ministry of Education initiated an essay competition for students from the elementary to the high school level on the topic of Austria, a tourism country. Teachers were asked to teach their students, quote, behavior that is supportive of tourism, such as politeness, courteousness, and open-mindedness when encountering foreign tourists. The author of the information sheet for teachers clearly links tourism with a larger societal discourse, emphasizing that the teaching of such behavior is, in essence, teaching the gute Ton, which is hard to translate, sort of a conservative behavioral code that includes the following areas: a polite greeting, the friendly providing of information, helpfulness, good hygiene. The author further emphasizes that children should meet with foreign tourists only if, quote, their clothing and their bodies are clean and appetizing. Which I'll leave it up to you what you make of that. A clean body, a nice hairdo are essential accomplishments from the perspective of tourism, end quote. The writer comforts teachers who might complain about additional work by pointing out that Austrians are naturally predisposed to being good hosts anyway. Quote, the world already perceives Austrians as charming and polite. Taking advantage of this reputation and improving it through education is our duty. These quotes illustrate how the discourse of tourism enables the performance of Austrian identity and how the rules, regulations, and norms of tourism merge with those of Austrian society. The very specific regulating of appearance and bodily habitus, as well as the request that teachers report noteworthy attractions in their region to the Ministry of Education, reveal that tourism also functioned as an instrument of surveying and disciplining the state and its citizens. The essay competition organizers introduce the already mentioned behavioral code, the gute Ton, as beneficial for the tourism economy. It becomes clear, though, that the desirable behavior is closely linked with a conservative patriarchal image of society. Take, for instance, the category beautification of the environment. So there were two images in that booklet. The first one showing a sort of dilapidated house facade, and the second one, the windows open, flowers, and then this young woman sitting on the bench in front of the house. The text of the booklet is as follows: 2 or 3 flower pots instead of a neglected piece of grass show that love takes care of this place. No reference to the anonymous woman, who we can assume is an illustration of love, beauty, and caretaking, a reading that goes very well with the promoted gender images of the then ruling Austrian People's Party. And the booklet is filled with comparisons of that sort. There are also, interestingly, pictures that show how to help those tourists who ask for directions. And twice, it's a young woman, I guess between 8 and 10 years old, who is shown as pouting and looking away and not answering to the tourist, whereas young boys are usually smiling and offering the requested information. So there was something going on about the young women not following the orders. To be clear, when I describe the tourism discourse as disciplining, I do not necessarily mean oppressive. I view the tourism discourse's disciplining effects as a manifestation of Foucault's notion of governmentality, a term that describes a complex and discursive web of power relations in which subjects participate voluntarily if they accept the goals of the system as their own. those who discipline themselves accordingly, as good citizens, as good community members, and so on, might utilize these goals and rules, however, to exclude others who do not fit. An example for this aspect of the tourism discourse is the anonymous editorial in a 1946 edition of the leftist Workers' newspaper, which claims, and that's an Austrian newspaper, which claims that the presence of too many displaced persons prevents a proper denazification of the prominent tourist and spa town of Bad Gastein in the Salzburg region. The writer points out, completely without irony, that developing a proper and desirable negative attitude against the former National Socialists is hampered by the presence of many visible and loitering foreigners. The foreigners are visible because they loiter, meaning they display a bodily posture not acceptable for a renowned tourist town such as Bad Gastein. The former Nazis, or still Nazis, so the implied argumentation, are a political problem, but at least they know how to behave properly. While giving preference to former National Socialists over their victims, and quite a few among the displaced persons were Jewish refugees or former concentration camp survivors. Giving preference to former National Socialists over their victims would have been impossible in a purely political context. Embedding the argument into the context of tourism enables the construction of an Austrian we against unwanted foreigners. And in fact, the argument was apparently so persuasive that the American commanders gave up some hotel spaces that they had required for the displaced persons and opened them up for tourism again. They were convinced by this economic argument and by the argument of self-sufficiency that tourists needed to come back in again. All of these examples show that tourism is not just a surface phenomenon, but that it constitutes a far-reaching discourse that provides insight into the complex and also contradictory process of Austrian identity formation after 1945. At a very volatile political time, when the future of the country was uncertain and people began to realize the extent to which they had participated in an immensely murderous undertaking, it is difficult to understand what concepts such as normality, society, nation-state meant for them. Tourism provides a kind of circuitous path to better understand people's desires, self-images, and attitudes at that time. Precisely because tourism is a discourse with a utopian potential, after all, instead of being a host, one might be able to travel oneself in the future. Studying Austrian tourism in the immediate post-war era sometimes provides a glimpse at identity constructions and spatial concepts that diverge from the officially prescribed Austrificated ones mentioned before. Some of the award-winning student essays of the competition that I mentioned before, all of which were preserved in a box in the Austrian State Archives where I found them, some of these essays undermine the desired conflation of tourism discourse and good Austrian citizenship. For instance, one student wrote that if tourists were to visit his small town in Lower Austria, he would show them the bomb craters and the destruction caused by the recent war, for, quote, there really isn't anything else to see. Presumably, if this student won an award, some of the other essays must have been even more frank in their descriptions of the effects of the war. Another female student described her plan to establish contact to wealthy tourists who could then help her to find work overseas so that she would be able to leave her boring village as soon as possible and to travel to more exciting countries. This is only a brief glimpse at the way tourism functioned as a matrix for complex identity performances in Austria's immediate post-war period. What I tried to show were snapshots of the ontological processes of making meaningful places. Since the political, social, and cultural contexts are changing constantly, the meaning of places and spaces does as well. And the authenticity of a place, especially of a tourist place, can never be fully determined. Let me conclude with an example some of you might know. For the longest time between 1964 and now, this place was one of the most inauthentic Austrian places from an Austrian point of view. This is the Sound of Music pavilion that was used for outdoor filming of Sound of Music in 1963 and 1964. All of the scenes that are in the movie were shot in the studio. So the dancing scenes, this is way too small, even though they had to lock it up because visitors tried to dance in there and hurt themselves by falling off the benches. The pavilion was left rotting in some depot in Salzburg until a group of film buffs got together and forced or convinced the city to put it up again. And first they didn't know where to put it up, thinking it doesn't fit with any of our real history that we have. It's this kitschy piece that only means something for Americans. However, over time, they realized, well, it still attracts lots of people, and there are all these Sound of Music tours, so they now put it up in the gardens of the Hellbrunn Palace, which is one of the iconic historical places in Salzburg. And so suddenly Sound of Music does have a place in the construction of Austria, even for Austrians. And there are now many Austrian-led tours in Salzburg that are attended by Austrian school classes, I found out when I last visited it. So it's not such a separation anymore between the kitschy tourist stuff for the others and the real thing for us. By now, as I said, even Austrian school children attend some of the Sound of Music bus tours, and the administration of Hellbrunn Castle, the previous summer residence of Salzburg's archbishops and one of the most important historical artifacts of Salzburg, has now integrated the Sound of Music pavilion in its garden exhibition and has thereby created a very material illustration to my musings about space, authenticity, and performance. And with that I end, and thank you for your attention. Okay. Hi, Kathy.
In addition to this identification as being not German, do you also during this period find an Austrian attempt to identify as not communist, as not East, given that you have a country that has all of a sudden found itself on the border of the Iron Curtain, is orienting itself, defining itself as Western as opposed to Eastern, which is where it really is, and where you have expellees coming in from the Sudetenland, from the east, wanting tourists from the west. So is that part of this as well?
Yes. In my experience, it is very much interwoven in other narratives, and probably because the time period that I'm looking at was considered to be so volatile that any proclamation of we are part of the West might have been read as a provocation of the Soviet occupation forces. And so the language is always very careful. There is a talk of the Western values or the European value system that they try to be a part of. Or I think most frequently it's called the Gemeinschaft der Staaten, the community of states and of nations, that is sort of code for more the Western hemisphere, because the Soviets are not part of the community of nations. But it's not as outspoken as this attempt to be non-German, which really includes attempts to define an Austrian ethnicity, trace it back to the Middle Ages, to see it can't be possible that we are German because we've always been Austrian.
Great talk.
Thank you.
So I have one question, which is, I thought it was really fascinating how you set up these kind of two archetypes of tourists.
The first one being kind of shallow and ignorant and perhaps materialistic, the first image that you produced. And then the one which is characterized by the Austrian tour book, which is kind of worldly, judgmental, paternalistic, and kind of almost omnipotent. It's judgmental quality. What happened to the tourist that it goes from this kind of good force to this kind of evil, kind of shallow bumpkin characteristic? How did that change in tourists?
I don't even see it as such a change. I see it more as things that existed simultaneously and that were evoked in particular circumstances, whatever was necessary. It was sometimes needed as a good force to create some change, and sometimes as the fearsome critical force that we need to be careful of. And I think the latter sometimes happened when regional politicians did not want to take a stance on something. They blamed it on tourism. We have to do it because it's important for tourism. It's not me who wants it. It's good for the tourists. So there was some argumentation in that way. I think there are moments in time, and the 1970s and 1980s were such a moment, when almost nothing good was to come of tourism, even though, and that's this maybe schizophrenic attitude, it was such an important economic factor. So we can't really get rid of it, but it's destroying us. It was seen as really damaging children in the schools, this whole focus on tourism, damaging the environment, distorting our economic structure because we are putting too much emphasis on that. And it is only maybe in the last 15 years that attempts at a slower paced tourism emerge, where tourism is seen as an opportunity to preserve certain areas in Austria, like landscapes or regions that have survived, and to do what's called sanfter Tourismus, soft tourism, that doesn't destroy the environment as much, that respects community structures and tries to be, to use a buzzword here that we use here, sustainable. I don't know if I really answered your question, but.
So they both existed at the same time. It wasn't that one was more temporally distinct than the other archetype.
That's my interpretation. Beth.
I really enjoyed your talk as well. And,
thank you.
Was particularly intrigued, not surprised, by the aspect that has to do with the way that Austria was trying to engender its image, to be perceived as less threatening, perhaps. But it's interesting the use of that particular image to do that, the Venus of Willendorf, because to my eye, that's a very powerful feminine image. You know, it's all defies typical notions of beauty and passivity, and it's all about watch out, I can make people. You know, I'm very powerful. So that's an interesting tension there for me.
I think this is what makes this book such a nice example for a deconstructive analysis, because sometimes it seems the authors and editors simply went for, like in this picture, I think they went for what's the oldest feminine icon or image that we can find, not considering interpretations such as yours, you know, like the power of this picture, or sometimes the flat-out contradictions that they created by making claims that would never work together. But I think at that point, they were just like, whatever. Deadly.
Summer of 1974, making salads and washing dishes in a hotel for Hallberg region. And most of the guests at this hotel were Germans on their way to Italy. And my German was not really sufficient to all the subtleties of what was taking place at this hotel. But it was clear to me that the owner of the hotel despised all of his guests kind of universally. And it seemed to me despised them in part because they were there at all, but also in part because they weren't staying. They were just marching through. And so I was curious if any of your work dealt specifically with German tourists in Austria, and the sort of resonance that might have as part of this kind of authenticity. What would be the nature of the authenticity where you're confronting a German guest in Austria?
It does, yes. I look at, in other parts of my project, I look at literary texts and films that deal with this encounter between Germany and Austria. And this is probably, that's the most prominent or also notorious element of tourism in Austria, that love-hate relationship with Germany, that I sometimes compare it when I hear Canadians talk about the United States. Same language, largely economic dependent on the United States. The media outlets are all in the United States, and yet separate countries. That's pretty much the situation that you have in Austria. Any writer, filmmaker who wants to find an audience has to go through German media outlets. There isn't very much of an audience simply in Austria. And with tourism, of course, it created this resistance or the rejection of the German tourist who seemed to have more money and be able to command all these things. And so what you heard was when the doors were closed in the kitchen and people were venting about the Germans. That's, yeah, lots of movies have been made about this, let's say it this way. Hal?
Can I follow up a bit on the remarks you made about soft tourism towards the end there? I was curious about that. But it seemed like much of your talk was indicating that the national identity of Austria since World War II has been formed largely in response to economic considerations. I wonder whether there are cases in which cultural or historical considerations trump economic considerations in the formation of Austrian national identity. And if not, whether you've considered or looked into the possibility of a kind of Marxist assessment of the formation of identity, since it's so governed by means of production, by sort of what one might call extraneous considerations to a more authentic understanding of what it means to be a member of this people.
I picked this angle on the economy to discuss tourism and tourism discourses in that setting. But I would agree with you that there are cultural and historical elements to the identity, this identity narratives and identity processes. And this question of Austria's Germanness did not start with World War II. That goes back back to the 18th century. The question of the difference between is Austria a state or is it also a nation is something that certain right-wing groups in Austria debate until this day, claiming it's not a nation because it's part of the German nation, but it's a separate state. And so there are historical lineages, there are cultural lineages that exist and that have been analyzed. Tourism has always been discussed as a sort of sideshow, but because it became so prominent after 1945 and it became the the lens almost through which all of this was seen, my project is to, as I said, to take it seriously in a way and to not claim it's the only one area where it happened, but to say that some of the important elements of everyday discussions of identity happened in this area and not in the tombs written by historians and historiographers.
But it's striking that school children in Austria are taken to see this Sound of Music site as if that were, I mean, I guess...
I didn't explain that properly. When I was there and talked to the teacher and the school children, they attended the tour as kind of an ethnographic project to understand how it was basically North American visitors look at places that are important because they appear in a North American film, and what are these places for these Austrian school children, and where does the meaning overlap and where does it completely diverge? So it was actually already a very sophisticated look at these places, more sophisticated than what I had when I was a school child. So.